Wood is the most important item in Minecraft, and 1.20 now has a total of 10 different types in it, but no worries, in this video I'll show you how to farm it all, from spruce to crimson to bamboo. Let's start with mangrove wood. Now to actually get the mangrove sapling, which is called the mangrove propagule, you do not want to just randomly start breaking the leaves of the mangrove tree. Now you can notice here on the bottom sides of the mangrove trees we do have these, and these are mangrove propagules. They tend to spawn rarely on the bottom of the leaves, but you can make them appear there if you want by just right clicking on them with a piece of bone meal. Once there is one of the little propagule buds there, they'll eventually grow into the full propagules fairly quickly, so there's not too much of a point of having to wait for that. The reason why you want to collect some mangrove leaves from the trees though, is that the best way of farming those propagules wherever you are is to set up a very large roof out of the mangrove leaves. You just want to right click on every single one of the bottom of these leaves to have the propagule buds appear there. There's also some ways of automatically doing this. Now once the propagules have grown all the way, which you know if it's the full length here, you can just break them, bone meal that slot again, and use this to get yourself a massive amount of the mangrove propagule. Propagules, unlike other saplings, can even be planted underwater, and you can even bone meal them underwater and have a mangrove tree that grows sort of from the bottom of the river there. But of course they do work above the water as well. The question then would be, what is the best way of farming the mangrove trees? So the ideal way of setting up one of these farms is to grow them in 8x8s, and if you have access to it, I would suggest using things like mycelium and podzol to really clearly mark out the area where you should be planting saplings. The reason for this is that you can mark out where to plant the saplings, because you can't actually plant them like that. What you need to do is place down one sapling and then bone meal it. Once you've done that, plant another propagule next to it and bone meal that. Go one more over, bone meal that, and of course break any blocks you may end up inside of, and continue on going from propagule to propagule throughout all of these, so that you plant down and bone meal to full growth of propagule on every single block throughout this entire farm. The problem about placing a bunch of propagules at once, then bone mealing one, is that these trees can actually grow right through the propagules, so it's fairly easy to unfortunately have those propagules go to waste. And once you've gone through the total 64 mangrove propagules, you'll be left with this massive mangrove tree, and all you have to do to mine this out successfully is just go up to one end and basically slowly dig your way up into it, and you'll eventually reach the solid mangrove log core. This area is completely full of the mangrove logs, and you'll just find absolutely huge amounts of them here. This takes the mangrove log from something that's actually quite difficult to get to incredibly easy, but let's move on from mangrove to bamboo. So bamboo was added to Minecraft in the 1.14 update, but it was not considered a wood type and didn't really function as a wood type until in Minecraft 1.20, its function has been completely changed. However, the way you grow it is still exactly the same. More or less the best way of harvesting bamboo is breaking it with a sword. If you don't have a bamboo jungle right next to you that you want to completely clear out of bamboo, the best way to grow this is to simply find a flat area and to plant an insanely large patch of it. That's right, there's basically nothing else to it. There's no real trick to make it grow faster. The best idea is honestly just to find an area and plant down hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of bamboo. And of course, once you've laid out that patch, you can see it grow, but generally a lot slower than this. And once it has grown all the way, you can just have a pile of swords next to it, go through it, break it with your sword, and pick up all the bamboo on the ground and harvest it again whenever you want more. So that's how you farm bamboo, but of course the question would be, what do you actually do with bamboo? The recipe is fairly simple. It is a 3x3 of bamboo, where basically 9 pieces of bamboo give us 1 block of bamboo. Now the block of bamboo should be thought of as a log type block in every single way. So really this is the block that we're farming. It's not really the bamboo, but it is these bamboo logs. However, there's a lot of things you can do with this still. So for instance, we can craft this into planks, but you will notice it only gives us 2 planks instead of the standard 4. So of course, once this is in planks, you can turn these planks into all kinds of different things, like let's say a crafting table or standard recipes like that. We can take these bamboo logs, which can be turned sideways or be upright, right click on them with that axe, and and turn them into stripped bamboo logs. And of course there's some really cool things you can make also if you, let's say, turn these into slabs, because you'll gain access to the bamboo mosaic that can also be turned into bamboo mosaic stairs and bamboo mosaic slabs. That is crafted by taking bamboo planks and then taking 2 bamboo slabs on top of each other. That gives you a bamboo mosaic. If you're wanting to know also some great ways of using these new bamboo blocks in building, I do have a video on different 1.20 building tricks, and I'll have an iCard on the screen right now, so be sure to check that out. Let's leave the overworld and travel to the nether. How do you grow crimson logs? Well, the crimson stem is of course the red nether wood, and you can just go into one of these forests and chop it down, but the actual way of farming this is a lot different. Similar to the mangrove propagules, the source of the saplings does not come from the leaves, but the only way of farming this is to first start by collecting some of this. Now this is known as nylium, and it's basically the red nether grass. The other thing you want to grab as well are these 1 block crimson fungus. Let's head back to the overworld. To farm the crimson stem, we first need to farm crimson fungus as well as crimson nylium. To farm the nylium, start by placing some of it down and surrounding it by as much netherrack as you can. What you need to do is get bone meal and bone meal the netherrack that is next to these nyliums, and that'll make them convert into the crimson nylium. Of course, once you've farmed a whole bunch of those, you can mine those up. What it's now time to do is to lay out again in a different area a big pile of the crimson nylium to begin with, and we're going to use this to farm the crimson fungus. So basically, bone meal, break all the blocks you see, bone meal, break, and continue on that way. The way to farm these is you need to get a piece of the crimson nylium and put a crimson fungus on top. Then right click on that with the bone meal a couple times. It generally tends to grow really quickly, and you will get one of these trees. The one unfortunate thing is that the crimson funguses just sitting here will not naturally turn into these giant trees. At every stage of growing these, we have to use bone meal. It doesn't work any other way. So now that we have a good source of nylium and the fungus, how do we farm it? I would suggest laying out maybe a 5x5 area of that crimson nylium, placing down a crimson fungus, bone mealing it, go next to it, look upwards, and if there's anything close, break that with the hoe, place down another crimson fungus and bone meal it, and let's say right here we want to just destroy all of these netherwort blocks that are right in the path, because when we place this next fungus, we want to make sure that those logs are not being interrupted by anything. Again, the same thing here, make sure to break anything in the way of this vertical area, so we get as many of these logs as possible. As crazy enough, if we, let's say, place down some netherwort blocks here and bone meal this, what you'll notice is it does not replace these netherwort blocks, and so if you don't break these, you're just going to get a bunch of patchy logs. But either way, continue this on again until eventually we have ourselves an absolutely massive core full of all of these crimson stems. What you want to do is start by getting rid of all the netherwort around it, and then dig straight into it with your axe. Chop all this until you get every block, and so that's how you grow that. But the big question would be, how do you do this with the other variant of nether wood? Believe it or not, the only real main difference between farming the crimson wood and the warped wood is the fact of what biome you get your initial materials from. So if you end up in the warped forest, what you want to do is just go through here and break a whole bunch of the warped nylium, as well as collect as many of these warped funguses as you can. But in terms of how you get more warped fungus as well as warped nylium, it is literally identical. You just bone meal a big patch of it and break any of them you see. And for instance with this, we can place down some netherrack, bone meal that, and just turn that into the warped nylium as well. And the same way when planting this, we'll just plant down our funguses, bone meal them, look above it to break any blocks and bone meal this, and do the same thing to make ourselves a mega tree. And again, eventually once we have that mega tree, we can break it to get all of the amazing warped stems in absolutely massive amounts if you grew yourself an insanely large tree out of this, as there's really no limit to how big you can make this. But enough about these nether woods, let's go on to the overworld and the more standard logs. What's the best way of growing the oak? Now, there are 2 types of oak trees. There is the standard short oak tree, which contains in it at very max 7 logs, but can be as short as 4. However, there's also the very uncommon giant oak trees, which do look pretty good, but can also be a pain to grow. The great news is though, there's actually a trick to always get giant oak trees if you want them. The first thing to do is to place down a sapling. Then you want to place a temporary block and a block on top of that. It could be a wool block or maybe even a glass block, literally whatever you want. Then once you have that, basically bone meal it, but usually better for it just to wait to grow, as it does tend to take a lot longer to grow this way, and when when it does eventually grow, you will always get a giant oak tree, or a different type of oak tree known as a balloon oak. But the reason why it can be a balloon oak as well, and why this works in the first place, is that these small oak tree sizes do not fit with this piece of glass being there, and so the game realizes that if it needs to grow a tree, it needs to be one of the big ones, because it thinks it can't fit with that glass block being there. So it can be a really good idea to set up an oak tree farm this way, have a bunch of oak trees all kind of separated, and then have yourself some glass blocks or whatever other block you want. In terms of the best way of farming this, there is one more really important thing to be aware of if you're farming oak trees, and that is if you have a flower next to the oak tree when it grows, there is then an additional 5% chance that you'll have a beehive appear next to it. It of course only happens 5% of the time, but it's really nice because if you're farming a massive amount of oak trees, what's the harm of just throwing a flower next to there? Because then you can have that additional chance for having a renewable source of the bee nest. But either way, what is the most efficient way of growing oak trees? Well, along with honestly all the other wood types, the most efficient way if we're going by pure efficiency of a manual method tends to just be planting down a huge amount of them at once, bone mealing one of them till they grow, and continue on to the next one, going through like that. You can even let them grow naturally this way, and then just bone meal them one by one, until eventually you have a massive clump of oak and you can go through here and chop them down. However, if you do want to grow these in a way that saves all the leaves, if you're trying to get a bunch of saplings, they should be 4 blocks apart. That'll make sure that all the leaves that are grown by these oak trees are not destroyed, unless of course they're the giant oaks, and by using this technique, we can get beehives or get giant oak trees or save this. Now is a small sub point of farming the oak logs, but this does still have to do with oak wood. How do you grow the azalea trees? You get these, by the way, in the lush caves or by bone mealing moss blocks, is you place it down and you have to bone meal it for it to grow. Sort of like the warped and crimson fungus, that way it needs to be bone mealed, and it'll always grow in one bone meal, which is quite interesting. It doesn't need multiple of them like most of the trees, and they also always turn towards one direction. So if you want to farm these, ideally, you want them to be maybe 6 or 8 blocks apart, so you can bone meal both of them, and if they do end up both turning towards each other, then they're not going to interrupt each other's leaves. If you want to get more saplings for these, the great news is the non-flowering azalea leaves do drop azalea bushes, and the flowering azalea leaves can drop the flowering azalea bushes. And although these two items have no difference in terms of what type of trees they give you, they are dropped by different leaf types, and can be great for decoration if broken with shearers. In terms of the most efficient way of getting oak wood from this, what you can do is place down an insanely large amount of these, bone meal them all, and then just go from there onto birch wood. Now believe it or not, birch wood is actually one of the hardest to get. And I'll tell you why, because there's not really any tricks to get it insanely efficiently. Birch forests used to be fairly rare, but the biome that used to be insanely rare is the tall birch forest, also known as the old growth birch forest. However, these can now be found about as commonly as the standard birch forest, so one good way of manually farming the birch trees is to just go to one of these old growth birch forests, and to chop down tons of these insanely tall birch trees you can get here, although unfortunately, unlike the oak trees, we cannot get an insanely large birch tree by just placing a block next to it. The flower trick does work on this, but just be aware it only works on birch trees and oak trees. So a good way of farming these could be to place a bunch in a row, place dandelions or some other easy to get short flower onto the side of them, and bone meal them all in a row, hoping for a beehive. The best way of growing it is just to put a bunch of them in a certain pattern, let's say a 5x5, go through bone mealing every single one to grow yourself an absolutely massive birch tree. Or honestly, a good thing about this is you don't actually have to bone meal it, you can let these naturally grow over time. So just like the oak trees, if you're going for a leaf, also known as sapling preserving method, so you can save the most of those as possible, place one down and put another 4 blocks between them to just make this grid of saplings. You can see in the air their leaves perfectly touch, but are not destroying each other's leaves. On to what's absolutely the easiest type of log to get, and that is the spruce tree. Spruce trees have 2 different types. The standard, more let's say oak or birch like variant, which is just a 1 block wide stem that goes into the air a fair ways with some of these leaves around it. But there's also the old growth giant variant of the spruce tree that is found in the old growth spruce taiga and the old growth pine taiga. Now these trees are what you definitely want to be growing, and this is the absolute easiest type of wood to get in the game. All you have to do is find a fairly clear area, Azalea, and place down a 2x2 of these spruce saplings. Then just bone meal one of them, and eventually it'll grow into one of these giant trees. These trees have so much wood in them that the average one, I would say, has about a stack to a stack and a half of wood logs in it. A really good piece of info to know though is how do you actually chop these down effectively. The correct thing to do though is to spiral up them. So start like this and basically make a spiral staircase, turning your direction once you get to the side. This is going to dig out a perfect staircase all the way up the tree, and once you're at the very top and have grabbed every single log that is here, then just look straight downwards and mine all the logs that are down here, finishing it up. What is the easiest way of growing spruce wood? What you want to do is place down one spruce tree, bone meal it, place another spruce tree next to it, bone meal it, continue this so on and so forth. Let's say making a 4x4 of the giant trees. Something really fun you can do if you want to actually with the giant spruce trees is use them to build a wall, build a base, or really build whatever you want to. It's really great because these giant trees are so tall and they're also double wide, and spruce saplings are fairly easy to get. You could plant a bunch of them in a row, or maybe just make a massive radius with them and literally be able to instantly make yourself a base. Once we've finished making our giant tree, again you just want to sort of dig your way up to the top of it and simply continue to mine the entire thing out until eventually you will end up with an insane amount of logs. And what's actually crazy to think is that you get so many logs from each one of these trees that with, let's say, a 4x4 of these, you could get yourself an entire shulker box full of these spruce logs from this insanely dense cube of wood. Now, jungle wood and jungle trees can be in two main formations, and something important to know about the jungle saplings, because the saplings are the root of every type of tree, is that compared to all the other tree types, they're super rare. This is because when the giant jungle trees were originally added to the game, they had an insane amount of leaves on them compared to most other tree variants, so Mojang thought that to avoid people having hundreds and hundreds of saplings, they would just make the drop rate lower, but that doesn't really make sense anymore considering the fact that certain variants of the spruce trees actually have more leaves in them than the jungle trees. You can also grow jungle trees in two different ways, but unlike the spruce, the small one is not the default. If you place down one of these saplings and you wait for them to grow, it'll grow into a small jungle tree with just one of the saplings there. But if you place down 4 of the saplings, in the same pattern you would do for the giant spruce trees, a 2x2, and we bone meal that, that will give us a giant jungle tree. And the question would be, what is the best way of farming these? Well, number one, to chop them down, it is that same spiral up method like it is with the giant spruce trees, but there is one main difference, which is with this type of wood, there are these branches that come out from it. So if you find one of those, you want to chop it down as soon as you find it, but by doing it this way and then of course breaking these on the way down, it works perfectly. Also, although it's in no way vital with any of the other tree types, I would say it is basically vital to break the jungle leaves with the fortune hoe when you're farming the jungle trees, and that's because the jungle sapling drop rate is just so incredibly low. Unless you want to run out of jungle saplings, oftentimes the best solution is to break all those with fortune, because you saw there I broke a whole bunch with fortune, and yet still we literally have only 3 saplings that dropped from that entire tree. Let's try farming it the same way as the spruce would. We place one down, we put down another jungle tree, we bone meal it. Well, we can bone meal this as much as we want and it's just not going to grow. We actually have to space these out. They cannot be grown into one giant single tree. The reason for that is because of the blocks above it. The jungle trees require a huge amount of blocks above them to grow, and so because of that we have to space these out. I would say again about 6 to 8 blocks of space, and if we don't have that, they're just not going to grow effectively. Now, dark oak in a lot of ways is quite different to the other tree types, and that's because there is no small variant to it. In fact, if you want dark oak wood, you have to make it in this giant tree size. Since if you place a dark oak sapling on the ground individually and you bone meal it, you can see literally nothing's happening, although we are definitely wasting all of our bone meal. So how do you actually grow these? Well, they should be planted in a 2x2 like this, bone mealed, and you'll see that'll quickly give us a giant dark oak tree, or just the standard size of dark oak tree. You don't have to bone meal it though. As long as these saplings are placed in their correct 2x2 pattern, they will eventually just grow by random ticks into that dark oak tree. And so in terms of the best way of planting these, I would suggest putting a 2x2 and then 6 blocks apart, putting another one of these dark oak trees. Once you have got one, the best way of chopping it down is pretty similar to all the other 2x2 logs, and that is to sort of make a spiral up them, but as well beware to grab the wider flare of logs that tend to be towards the top. This makes it so that the dark oak trees are probably the second easiest type of wood to get, and so this would be like an ideal setup. We have a 2x2 here, And then you'll notice right over here we have 6 blocks away another 2x2, and when these grow, the leaves exactly touch, which is perfect. Onto the last wood type, which is a lot more orange than the others. That is the acacia tree of the savanna. Now to chop them down is not always exactly that easy. The problem is that sometimes you can't reach all of the logs with your axe. So what you generally want to do is always start by breaking the log above the first one. If you start with the first one, you can't usually reach all of the logs that you want to get to. These trees also grow kind of sideways, which definitely makes them be somewhat of a pain. So sometimes maybe having a ladder next to some of these blocks to climb up and mine those logs from could be good. But the question is, what's the most efficient way of farming this? Well, just because of how strangely they grow, with these leaves being super far away from the center, if you want to actually grow these without any leaves being destroyed, I would suggest planting them 8 to 10 blocks apart. But if you don't really care about the leaves, then what you'd want to do is what you do with every other type of tree if you want to get a bunch. Simply place them down in a massive pattern, bone meal them one by one. The problem is there is a lot of waste, as generally a lot of the logs will go through each other, but it still can work, and going through it like this, if you already have a ton of saplings, and you can do that by breaking all the leaves with a fortune hoe, you can go to this massive log of acacia and go through it super easily to get yourself this grey outer barked and orange centered wood. But whatever you do with it, that is the way of growing the acacia tree. I hope you enjoyed that tree farming guide. If you did, make sure to press the like button, subscribe to see more content like this, and I, Craft MC, will see you in the next one. Goodbye.